At the end of World War II, Japan's GDP per capita was about 6 times smaller than that of the United States. It was an utterly poor and devastated country. But when no one expected it, the Japanese economic miracle occurred, and 20 years later, the gap was only 30%. An economic boom unprecedented in history up to that point. However, we're not here today to talk about that because, as you may not know, Japan didn't just have one economic miracle, but two. The true miracle, the most difficult milestone, and the one with the greatest impact on Japan's future, was how this archipelago joined the Industrial Revolution. And nothing illustrates this better than its relationship with China. Until the late 19th century, Japan was a very impoverished country, even compared to medieval Europe. It was so poor that China, the richest, most populous, and most powerful country in the world, didn't even try to conquer it. The country was so wretched that no one wanted it, not even for free. China was a gigantic empire with tons of vassal states like Korea. But Japan, a naval invasion would be far more expensive than all the riches they could extract from there. Nevertheless, around 1890, something changed completely. The Meiji Restoration, which broke out 20 years earlier, abolished feudal society and modernized the country. The economy industrialized at breakneck speed. And in the 1930s, that country they had ignored because it was small and poor went on to invade China. It conquered Manchuria and established its own puppet government, placing at its head the emperor, whom the Chinese had dethroned a few years earlier. Their industrial superiority was so great that it took the United States entering the war to turn the tide. But even before that, in 1905, the Japanese had already defeated another great nation, Russia. So the questions are clear. How could such a small country conquer the all-powerful China? What exactly was this Meiji Restoration that propelled Japan to the top of the world powers? And what lessons can we draw from this whole story? At VisualEconomik, we're going to tell you all about it. But first, if you're interested in the world of investing, if you want to learn how to manage your savings, protect yourself against inflation, and learn how to make money beyond your day job, I've got some news for you. At Visual Factory, we have created the Visual Factory Club, a newsletter where every week we send out free content focused on essential financial education, the ABC of what everyone should know to understand the stock markets, financial markets in general, investment platforms, how to assess investment opportunities, and which markets may have more or less potential. Because of course, if you want to invest your money so you're not at the mercy of your country's economic instability, you at least need to understand the basics of the financial world. In the Visual Factory Club, you'll learn all of this completely free of charge. Through the link below and this QR code, you can sign up for the club and start receiving the upcoming editions. What's more, when you sign up, you'll receive a dossier where I explain, in a clear and simple way, the most essential investment concepts, what multiples or the PE ratio are, what indices are, ETFs, derivatives, funds, EPS, you get the idea. After that, every week you'll receive additional materials and market analysis to help you stay informed about what's really going on. And by the way, the sooner you sign up, the better. Since we send each episode of the series by email and every edition is unique, if you're not subscribed, you might miss some of them and you won't be able to access them later. But with that said, let's get into this video. To understand why we say the Meiji Revolution was Japan's true economic miracle, one thing must be made very clear. Its starting point was truly dire. Japan wasn't just poor, it also took a very long time to industrialize, and this gives us an idea of just how harmful its institutions were. In this chart, you can see both aspects. The bars represent each country's wealth at the moment it began to experience modern economic growth. That is, starting from the turning point, at which GDP per capita begins to grow sustainably thanks to a steady increase in productivity. Of course, comparisons between countries are always very complex, especially these days, and there isn't a specific moment when countries transition to modern economic growth. It's a process that takes longer in some cases and is shorter in others. But anyway, this is the best we have, and we can highlight two things. First of all, Japan was very poor. When it began to industrialize, it was half as wealthy as the United Kingdom before the British invented the steam engine, and 4 times poorer than the United States. But on top of that, they joined the Industrial Revolution very late. The British revolutionized their economy in the mid-18th century. The United States and many European countries made the leap around 1830. But Japan remained a medieval economy until the late 19th century. To give you some context, cars the gramophone, and even the AC transformer already existed. But let's get to the point. What on earth happened for Japan to go from being isolated to becoming an industrial powerhouse? It all began in 1853. With some black ships flying the Stars and Stripes flag. The United States was knocking on the door, or rather, breaking it down. Until then, Japan had lived practically shut off from the rest of the world, something similar to what we see today in North Korea. Yes, there were a few Dutch traders, a few Christian missionaries, but little else. The country was sealed off by decision of its royal family, the Tokugawa shogunate, until the Americans showed up. State-of-the-art warships, far superior technology, and at the helm, Commodore Matthew Perry. Either you open up the country, or you'll find out what we're capable of. Spoiler, they opened the gates. In reality, the US didn't have a huge interest in Japan either, but it suited them as a strategic outpost. And Americans don't like being told no. Here comes the interesting twist, because no, the United States didn't turn Japan into a capitalist country by force. In fact, from this point on, they hardly play a role at all. Their role in this story was to demonstrate that the Tokugawa were not as strong as they thought they were. Their legitimacy plummeted, and that was the spark for a major rebellion that would turn into a full-blown civil war. To avoid making a 2-hour video, let's summarize it a lot and say that basically the reformists won. By the way, many of them also wanted to kick out foreigners, but they weren't stupid, they knew they couldn't. The shogunate falls, and in its place, the emperor returns. Until then, he was merely a figurehead. Now, the symbol of a new Japan. And once again, another purely decorative figure. That emperor was a 15-year-old boy, Meiji Tenno. He gave this era its name, the Meiji Restoration. But of course, a teenager doesn't run a country. Real power falls into the hands of an elite group of reformers with a very radical agenda to dismantle Japan in order to rebuild it. Goodbye to the feudal system, hello to the modern state. Not democracy quite yet, but that didn't stop the system from taking a 180-degree turn. New institutions, industry, army, education, an entire country reinventing itself at breakneck speed. How exactly did they do it? Well, let's take a look. First and foremost, the social classes were abolished. Between 5 and 7% of the population were samurai, and in some regions like Edo, now Tokyo, there were many more. Although there were many types of samurai, almost all of them were a fiscal burden because they received public salaries, rarely had a real job, and almost never paid taxes. But the most significant change was the abolition of peasant serfdom and the restrictions on merchants, who were considered the lowest class of all. Now, peasants were free to buy and sell land, as well as plant the crops they wanted, rather than those ordered by their feudal lord. What's more, and this was the real key, they gained the freedom to leave their villages and seek a livelihood elsewhere. And so, starting in 1876, more than 60,000 peasants a year left the countryside to become the workforce that would create one of the world's most powerful industries. 3 out of every 4 new industrial workers came precisely from here, from rural areas. But the modernization of the state went much further. One of the great successes was the creation of a single currency for the entire archipelago. Up until then, Japan was a society with very little use for money. Taxes, for example, were usually paid in rice, not cash. What's more, only 5% of agricultural workers were paid a salary as such. Then, each feudal lord had his own mint, where he minted whatever currency he wanted. The result? 200 different coins of terrible quality. On top of that, as was to be expected, these feudal lords used the old trick of devaluing the currency to finance themselves. It's estimated that around 10% of tax revenues came from this source, which is quite significant. So the new government imposed a single currency for everyone. The yen pegged its value to silver and centralized its issuance. But the new government didn't just take away the feudal lords' power to issue currency, it took away practically everything from them, from most of the land to the power to collect taxes. In 1870, just after the start of the Meiji Restoration, 90% of the taxes collected by the central government were taxes on the feudal lord's land. After all, they are the easiest to collect. 70 years later, they would not even account for 1%. Instead, much more more efficient taxes, such as income tax, were used. This was made possible by improvements in census data and bureaucracy. What's more, direct taxes gradually lost ground to indirect taxes, particularly a kind of VAT on alcohol and tariffs ranging from 10 to 20%. That wasn't all. Something very important we need to talk about is debt. Ultimately, the best indicator of how advanced a state is to look at its debt. Debt is like everything in life. Healthy in a small amount, not too much, but not too little either. In fact, the least indebted countries in the world aren't usually wealthy nations that are very responsible with their public finances, but rather states so broke that no one wants to lend them money. Well, in 1870, Japan's debt was virtually non-existent, less than 1% of GDP. By comparison, Germany's was 25% and France's was 50%. Yet by 1913, just 40 years later, Japan was already financing 50% of its GDP. Thanks to centralization and fiscal reforms, the new government was able to invest in key infrastructure that no feudal lord could finance on his own. We're talking about bridges, canals, irrigation systems, and of course, railroads. A trip between Tokyo and Osaka, which used to take 19 days by palanquin, now took just 19 hours, and the cost of transporting goods fell by more than half. But if we had to pick just one thing from everything the government did, it would undoubtedly be the codification and translation of technical manuals. I know it doesn't sound very glamorous, but its importance was crucial. The fact is, the Japanese who wanted to join the Industrial Revolution had one major problem. They didn't know how the machines worked. Even if they imported them from abroad, they couldn't modify them to better suit local industry. In 1870, 85% of all engineering manuals and books were written in just 4 languages: English, French, German, and Italian. And of the remaining 15%, almost none were in Japanese. So the government got to work. It hired an entire army of translators, to the point that 3 out of every 4 translators in the country were government officials. On top of that, these civil servants had to invent thousands of new words to refer to machine parts or the processes they carried out. Well, in just 20 years, Japan had more technical books translated into its language than Germany did. And according to several scientific studies, this factor was key to industrialization. All of this laid the foundation for Japan's growth. As you can see, it was an express modernization.
Japan uniquely marginalized its feudal elite, withdrew its hand with a propitious mass privatization that rallied the private sector, marginalized an otherwise entrenched first generation of wealthy industrialists, and remained open to foreign trade and capital.
The result would be an unprecedented industrial boom in just 20 years. But one key ingredient is still missing. This is where the face on the 10,000 yen bills enters the scene. The man nicknamed the father of Japanese capitalism, Shibusawa.
From the Meiji Revolution to the Industrial Revolution.
This man's story is quite ironic. He was born into a family of farmers, and from a young age joined the ranks of the pro-emperor Meiji Revolutionaries. He even planned a terrorist attack, but his friends convinced him it would be a pointless suicide mission. In the end, he gave up terrorism and went to work as an accountant for the shogun. He rose through the ranks because he was very smart, and this same shogun sent him to the Paris Expo to accompany his younger brother. There, Aichi was fascinated, but not by the cutting-edge technology or the wealth of Europe. What truly fascinated him was finance, banks, checks, double-entry bookkeeping with assets and liabilities, and above all, the stock market. When he returned from Paris, the shogunate had already fallen. The Meiji Restoration had triumphed, and there, Aichi saw his opportunity. He was the architect of the new banking legislation, and he also founded Japan's first modern bank, which is now Mizuho Bank. But as the banking sector began to get a little out of control, he also ended up supporting the creation of the Bank of Japan in the model of the Bank of England. And it didn't end there. He was also the driving force behind the Tokyo Stock Exchange. In short, this man carried the country's financial sector on his shoulders. But the main reason he appears on 10,000 yen bills today is because of all the companies he's financed. He contributed significantly to more than 500 different ones. Among them are many of the country's leading energy energy companies, the country's first private railway company, which is the predecessor of current companies like the JR Group, Sapporo Breweries, and Fujitsu. While the modernization of the state allowed the Japanese to start and create companies, Aichi was largely responsible for bringing these ideas to fruition. If companies are cars, this man ensured that instead of driving on a dirt road, they drove on an 8-lane highway. Of course, he wasn't the only important figure. There's also Yataro Iwasaki, the founder of Mitsubishi. As you know, Mitsubishi does everything: cars, appliances, oil, real estate, microwaves. It's one of the 4 major zaibatsu, gigantic conglomerates that grew thanks to government contracts. Normally, these groups, these oligopolies, are viewed more negatively than Shibusawa's Aichi's companies. Part of this is because Aichi had a philosophy of social capitalism that took deep root in Japan, and which served as the perfect gateway for the West into a society steeped in Confucian ideas. However, one thing must be acknowledged. Zaibatsu, like Mitsubishi, were efficient companies, and in a country where capitalism is so underdeveloped, having such large conglomerates can be beneficial. Since everything is under one company, there are fewer coordination issues. You don't need contracts or a reliable legal system that respects property rights, and it also serves as a shield against the greed of local politicians.
Pyramidal business groups emerged to propel the big push. An undisputed controlling shareholder focusing on the apex firm's value prevents hold-up problems and coordinates cross-industry subsidies as group member firms tap public equity markets to capitalize cascades of subsidiaries spanning all relevant industries.
Clearly, despite all the corruption, the Zaibatsu functioned far better than the Meiji government's other bet on industrialization: public enterprises. The government nationalized a large number of companies, primarily mines, metallurgical plants, and shipyards. It did not create many companies on its own, but it did invest a great deal of money in them. Between 1868 and 1885, subsidies to public and semi-public enterprises exceeded 130 million yen, roughly 2 or 3% of GDP per year. That doesn't seem like much, but remember that the old states were very small. The Japanese state's total share of the economy was around 10%, so this industrial policy was actually quite expensive. However, these companies were veritable money pits. Far from generating profits, they put the government in the red. And to make matters worse, an insurrection broke out. Suppressing it was not cheap. It cost 70% of the annual public budget. And so the government ran out of money very quickly and had no choice but to resort to massive privatizations. In this table, you can see what it cost the state to expropriate some of the country's largest companies. And next to that, the sale price. Despite all the money invested, the vast majority of companies were sold at a loss, and not exactly small ones. For example, in order to expropriate Kamaishi iron ore, the government had to pay 2.3 million yen in compensation. But then, the government sold it for only 12,000 yen. That said, these days it is the famous Nippon Steel, a giant company you may recognize from its controversial acquisition of US Steel, which both Donald Trump and Joe Biden have opposed. So why did so many of these companies fail? It certainly wasn't because they paid wages that were too high, I can tell you that much. Wages in Japan grew much more slowly than the economy because the government suppressed workers to finance companies. We see this in the development of all Asian countries, and we've explained it to you countless times on this channel. The key to their failure is almost ironic. Japan wasn't lagging behind. It was way too far ahead. You see, the Meiji government did something impressive. It modernized the country at a breakneck pace. That much is clear. But in the process, it made one fatal mistake: copying the West, without understanding the context. Because yes, in England or France there were large factories, giant machines, and fierce competition to develop the most efficient prototype. But Japan wasn't England. Capital was very, very expensive, and labor was much, much cheaper. Especially when you consider that Japan had a very high literacy rate for such a poor country, so almost any worker could perform fairly complex tasks. Even so, the government thought, if they're rich like that, well, we'll do the same. Light industry was equated with a poor country, and Japan wanted to play in the big leagues. The result? They imported the best machinery, the latest and greatest from factories in Paris and London, and they did so in massive quantities. To give you an idea of the scale, The state accounted for barely 10% of the economy, but it generated 3 out of every 4 horsepower in heavy industry. And there's more. 90% of heavy industry workers were employed by public companies. But wait, because they also applied the same approach to light industry. But this industry never became productive. It made no economic sense. Let's look at an example: the textile industry. The Japanese private sector was flying high. Before World War I, they had already surpassed the British in productivity and conquered global markets. The government had to shut down more than 2,000 workshops. Why? Because they were playing different games. Private workshops used simpler machines, often powered by water wheels, like the ones Germany had used 70 years previously. Mind you, this doesn't mean these companies didn't innovate, quite the opposite. But they weren't looking for the most powerful machine, they were looking for the one that worked best in Japan. Instead of automating the most processes, they focused on complementing the vast artisan workforce in these workshops. Meanwhile, public companies were in a league of their own. Giant machines with thermal or electric motors which produced 10 or 100 times faster than those in private workshops, but at a colossal cost. As if that weren't enough, they produced products for which there was no demand, while the competitors' products retained a handcrafted touch that added significant quality. Those from these factories were completely generic. And in this regard, England and France did it better. The result was an extremely expensive inventory. That didn't sell. Even so, Japanese industry grew at a very healthy pace, between 1880 and 1900 at 4.5%, in the following 2 decades at 5.5%, and in the next 2 at 6.5%. During this period, exports also grew by around 8% annually, and imports by 6%, much more than the economy. In other words, Japan was opening up more and more to the world. It's true that this opening was accompanied by a sharp rise in tariffs. Do you remember Commodore Perry and his American ships? The agreement that the Japanese signed with him included reduced tariffs, but when the clause expired, they tripled them to match the levels of France or Germany. However, you have to keep in mind that such high tariffs were not at all uncommon at that time. Those in the US were twice as high, much higher than Donald Trump's. And to deliver the final blow to its economy, Japan did not remain stuck in light industry, despite having a major advantage there. Starting after World War I, private industry made the leap from light to heavy industry, this time naturally, and with enviable international competitiveness. Between 1907 and 1935, the share of machinery, automobiles, metallurgy, and the chemical industry in total industrial production grew by 22 percentage points to 43%, surpassing the United Kingdom. Japan's institutional foundation was very solid, and as we've seen, the government reacted quickly to its failures and divested itself of most of these companies. Ironically, the finance minister who carried out these privatizations came to power as a replacement for another who had been ousted from the government, precisely for proposing this very same thing a few years earlier. There were major exceptions, of course. You all know that Japan became very belligerent during this period, tripling the percentage of military personnel in just 2 decades. And, as was to be expected, there were countless government companies whose sole purpose was not to make money, but to supply the military. In the end, Japan used the success of its industrial revolution to conquer its neighbors in the most brutal way possible. And we all know the result. During World War II, Japan destroyed the wealth it had accumulated over decades in just a few years. Nevertheless, the foundations of its economy, everything we've told you, were still there. And they were what made Japan's second economic miracle possible, which led to the land of the rising sun to compete on a per capita GDP basis, head to head with the United States itself. In any case, now that we gotten this far, it's your turn. Did you know about the Meiji Restoration? Were you surprised by how quickly a country that started from such a disadvantaged position managed to industrialize? What do you think was the most important factor that made this possible? Feel free to leave your answers down in the comments. And don't forget that here on VisualEconomik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe if you haven't already to make sure you don't miss out on any of our upcoming episodes. If you liked this video, hit like, and we'll see you in the next one. Take care. See you soon.